We are back for the second half of day one, and we're going to jump right into a session with Professor John List about new ideas and innovation, and how can behavioral science play a role in creating new ideas and innovation, and how can it help us assess how to make people adopt new ideas and innovation. So that'll be the kickoff of our session for this afternoon, and we'll see you after this 45-minute conversation with John List. Thanks.
Welcome everybody to the second half of our first day here at the Human Advantage Conference. As we open the afternoon session, we are discussing new ideas, new product and innovation. For this session, I am going to leave most of the questioning to my colleague Ted Utoff. Ted is our Global Chief Officer at BVNH Consulting. But I do want to briefly, if possible, introduce our guest speaker for this session, Professor John A. List. John is a Kenneth C. Griffin Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago, a Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Australian National University, as well as previously serving as a Chief Economist at both Lyft and previously Uber, and now at Walmart. John has served on the Council of Economic Advisor and is a recipient of numerous awards. I told you that it would be quite long, and honors, including the Galbraith Award. John has authored over 250 peer-reviewed journal articles and a number of books, including with Yuri Gnizzi, the best-selling The White Axis, and this year's bestseller, The Voltage Effect, How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. Welcome, John. A big thanks for being with us. We are really very excited and happy to have you here with us on day one of the Human Advantage. Welcome, John.
Eric, thank you so much. And it's great to see both you and Ted again. Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for spreading the scientific word. You're doing great work, and keep it up, and I'm just so glad to be here.
It is good to see you again, John. I trust we can put our upper Midwest rivalry behind us for the sake of the audience and carry on.
We're like a modern day Sharks versus the Jets, right?
I think so. This kind of Mississippi River border. Yeah. As Eric mentioned, we're headed into this afternoon session thinking about new ideas, new products. Previously this might have been solely under the domain of innovation consultancies or design thinking. But increasingly, there is interest in involving a behavioral point of view. In your eyes, John, what does behavioral science bring to the game? Or maybe I should say, how can behavioral science help organizations think about and develop new services or products?
It's a good question. So one way to think about this is that we could talk about behavioral entrepreneurship, which is really how behavioral science and entrepreneurship can come together in a very important area of study. Now, when you think about entrepreneurship, you could think about, does behavioral science give us insights anywhere in the channel of entrepreneurship? And I would say yes, yes, and yes. It actually gives us insights in every area. Well, I would say from soup to nuts. So let's think about what that means. The very beginning of entrepreneurship starts with an idea. And you have to think about what are the best ways to generate evidence to figure out if my idea is worthwhile. And right away, you're confronted with what behavioral scientists call confirmation bias. If we have an idea, we generate evidence, and we generate it, one, in a way that favors our approach or our idea. And then when we get the actual data, we view it in a light that has confirmation bias. If it's in our favor, we say, voila, I have the evidence. And if it's against us, we say, probably an outlier, probably a false positive. There's a flaw in the way that we generated the data, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the beginning of entrepreneurship. But then after we launch, You could think about execution. And behavioral science, of course, comes up in every facet of execution. Think about incentives. Behavioral scientists have generated a lot of insights along the lines of worker incentives, or at Walmart, what we would call associate incentives. You could think about incentives on the consumer side. What are the best ways to think about pricing or the value proposition? This is all behavioral science. So now, as you can see, behavioral science is really soup to nuts. And when we have an idea, it will have a place at every point in the chain.
Great. And many new products and services are launched within the market every year, but not all succeed. In fact, most fail. Any thoughts on why that might be the case, and or if how a deeper understanding of behavioral science might prevent failure or improve rates of success?
Yeah. So ideas fail for two primary reasons. One is the idea never had a chance. And the idea never had a chance to scale, which I know we'll talk about in some time. So think about in the 90s, the McDonald's CEO had an idea called the Arch Deluxe. And his idea was this Arch Deluxe is a great sandwich. So I want to introduce it to the market. But he said, I want to generate evidence before introduction, before I spend a bunch of money in scaling it and generalizing it to all the stores. I want some evidence to show that the Arch Deluxe is a good sandwich. So what did he do? He basically did what everyone does. He brought in a focus group. Okay, so what's the issue here? First of all, the people who agree to come into the lab to eat McDonald's burgers are probably burger lovers or McDonald's lovers. So there's a selection problem in doing this, and you need to adjust your data for that selection and make sure you don't fall prey to confirmation bias. The second reason is a very behavioral sciencey description of what happens in surveys. So think about this particular survey. You try a bite of the sandwich and you say, oh, it's okay. But the survey says, if it's introduced, would you pay $3.50 for it? You're like, okay. Now, the reason why you say yes is because you are buying a free option. Think about the stock market. We all the time buy options, call options, and that gives us the right to purchase a stock, for example, in the future at a specified price. We have to pay for that. And we pay for that because the option is important. In the survey case, there's no cost. And the benefit is there might be something introduced in the future that I might like. And if I like it, I get to consume it. So if you ask me, will you pay $3.50? Sure. Will you pay $4.50? Sure. Will you pay $5.50? Sure. We have to understand that there are behavioral incentives underlying focus groups. And a lot of times, if you don't adjust for it, for what I'm talking about here, both the selection effect and the behavioral effect, we're going to have false signals. So now that's very important. That's what I, again, would call ideas fail because they should have never been introduced to begin with. Now, in the second camp, you have ideas that should have been introduced, but people just don't execute. And they don't execute because of simple behavioral or economic reasons. Like, think about optimal quitting. We don't quit enough. And the fact that we don't quit enough is because of both society telling us we shouldn't quit. Right? You know from the upper Midwest, the greatest football coach ever, right? Vince Lombardi. And don't say
we said we were going to get along today.
Chad, if you say some old Viking coach and you just start talking about Fran Tarkenton, I know you're off the deep end, because when it comes to football, you just need to look at the Super Bowl trophy. It says the Lombardi Trophy. Okay, so I know you're thinking about Bud Grant and all the Super Bowls that Bud Grant lost in the late 70s, but let's get back to business here, Ted. So when you think about quitting, society tells us quitting is bad, and you can just look at inspirational posters about why we shouldn't quit. But the other one's a very behavioral sciencey reason why we don't quit, and that's because we neglect the opportunity cost of time. And entrepreneurs who have a good idea and they introduce it, if they don't understand that pivoting is okay, quitting that idea and pivoting should be a very useful thing to always think about and always do. And that decision will depend on opportunity cost. And opportunity cost, what I mean by that is as you mentioned, Eric said, John was at Lyft as a chief economist, and he just moved to Walmart. The reason why I moved was not because anything was wrong with Lyft. I love Lyft. It was because my opportunity set got better. And when your opportunity set gets better, that means your opportunity cost of staying at Lyft gets higher. And if it gets too high, you rotate or you pivot or you quit. So I quit Lyft and I moved to Walmart. So there are these aspects both within should you ever have scaled it or introduced it, and then secondly, are you executing? And I think those are really the features of the, let's say, most enterprise value and most enterprise decisions are based in those two buckets.
I think, John, you're preaching to the converted for Eric and I, people who spent the previous part of our careers in market research before becoming applied behavioral scientists. That's really been, Eric's life work building the previous agency he had, and much of my work is this idea of how do you take a practice that so many clients are bought into, which is market research, but how do you do it, A, with behavioral science in mind, but B, also trying to test in context. So to your point, not purchase intent, but actual purchase, or making decisions in the context that they're made. What I would say, and what I think Eric and I have found, is that making that shift with clients has taken a very long time because they're benchmarking off of data they already have, or that they believe straight from the horse's mouth, excuse the pun, that consumers can rationalize and can communicate their future behavior. And that I think we're getting there, but that has been a real battle, I would say, for our colleagues in the market research world.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't doubt that consumers can do a reasonable job trying to forecast or saying, here's what I like right now. But we have to understand, do they want to tell you the truth, or is there an incentive that will lead them to say, I'm going to overstate my preferences? We see this all the time in contingent valuation. Yeah, contingent valuation, we see this all the time. That's a survey-based approach to measure the non-marketed value of goods and services. And there's an incentive to do that. In the focus groups, there's an incentive. And we have developed ways to overcome or attenuate those biases through behavioral science. I'm saying keep doing focus groups, but understand they have two major flaws. One's selection and one's behavioral. And you should do everything you can to address those. Otherwise, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is the exact same thing that happened to the McDonald's CEO. He took those data and he said, oh, look, everyone loves the Arch Deluxe. He introduced it. It was a massive failure. He lost his job because he spent so much in terms of resources and time and introduced a product that failed that he got fired. And it was perfectly avoidable had he had a little bit of, there's a selection issue here and a behavioral issue, and we should at least address it before we start to run and introduce this product.
We opened the Human Advantage event this morning with a discussion with Cass Sunstein, as you know, and we came across this quote from Cass about you, and I quote, "List has done more than anyone else to advance the methods and practice of field experiments." So as our resident expert in field experiments and coming off what we've just been talking about, I want to press you here a little bit. As we often say at BVA Nudge Consulting to our clients, behavioral science is science, so we should be testing. And while I think our clients agree in principle, the realities of many of their businesses is that there simply isn't time to conduct a kind of proper randomized control trial, or the pace of their business can't wait, or the budgets just don't allow. So any pointers for experimenting in the field with that kind of business mindset or that business cap on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, that's very generous of Cass. I appreciate that. I do have pride and priority, so it's nice. I think you've pinpointed the two major obstacles that I have learned about through my work with organizations, whether it's a governmental organization, a nonprofit, or a for-profit. It's kind of two obstacles that go along the lines of, one, we don't have time for that, and two, it's just too expensive. It will cost resources beyond time. It will cost real resources that we just don't have. Let's take those on one by one. So the first one, it's really never made sense to me that if you are going to introduce an idea or product, why not do it in a way that you can examine if it's working or if your approach is working? You're going to introduce it anyway. Okay, at Uber, we have a new product. Let's introduce it in a staggered fashion. We want to introduce it maybe in Seattle, maybe in Chicago, maybe in Atlanta first. That's what we did with tipping. We introduced it in a staggered way that would allow us to examine what have been the effects of tipping. If we would have done it all at once, first of all, it doesn't make sense most of the time to do it all at once because you're going to have bugs. It's harder to do it because it's so many resources at once. It just seems optimal to me to do it in a staggered type of approach anyway, or hold some people back. That's what you need to do to use science to test. In the Uber case, does tipping raise wages? Do consumers like tips? The ability to give a tip. Does service quality improve because of tipping? These are all important questions around tipping that we answered because we introduced tipping in a staggered way. That's science. That's generating data empirically, experimentally to learn. Okay, so now we've dispatched number one. Makes no sense to say we don't have time. That's dumb. It allows you to run faster, let's be honest. Number two, people say it costs money. And sometimes it does cost money. You have to bring in a person to design the experiment, try to do it fast in a staggered way. You might have to use incentives. You might have to do it maybe in a way that is a little bit of resource cost. But let's be honest, the true cost here is the opportunity cost of not knowing what works and why. And when you don't generate data, and you don't figure out what customers want or if our approach is better than an alternative approach, every day you live by not knowing what's optimal, that's a huge opportunity cost of time. So I can give you all kinds of examples from Lyft around pricing or other means that if we wouldn't have tested a new approach, we would have just kept the status quo, not knowing that there was a better means. That's an opportunity cost of time, because every day that goes by and you're not acting in an optimal way, that's the true cost here. It's not the small resource cost outlays that are happening to scratch off 3 lottery tickets. I mean, think of it that way. You're scratching off 3 lottery tickets, 1 or 2 of them are probably going to hit because there's a lot of behavioral science that's behind a lot of these innovations, and they've been found in other settings. And then the one that works, you implement. And now your organization is a lot better from that day going forward. And the benefits are accruing through time, right? Now you have this flow, this integral over time of great benefits that you would have been without because there's a huge opportunity cost of not knowing. So in that way, the second argument just doesn't hold for a rational firm. It's the opportunity cost of not knowing. That's the true cost here, not the small resource outlays.
Okay. So naturally, part of assessing whether an innovation or a new product or service is worth pursuing is about understanding scalability. Scalability, of course, focus of your latest book, The Voltage Effect. Can you share with our audience how you came to this theme of scalability, and maybe share with them some lessons from the business world? And I'm going to push you a little bit here, John. You've talked about Lyft and Uber as a service provider, but some of our clients, would be, or some of our attendees would also be in the world of products, where
Sure.
I think that cost outlay, I'm going to push you, is a little bit more intense.
I think that's crazy. I mean, look, I work for Walmart. That's product, right? I have the exact same examples I can say at Walmart, where we're moving product and giving people a chance for free delivery or Walmart Plus or employee benefits, et cetera. It's the same. Incentives are the same. But let's now go first to your question. Look, I started, as I told you both the last time we talked, I started a preschool in 2010. And the preschool was really successful in improving kids in Chicago Heights, which is an underserved community, kids that are 3, 4, and 5. And the curriculum in school worked. And then I tried to scale it. And I started talking to policymakers about, let's get this curriculum to every kid in the world. And they told me, you're on a fool's errand, basically, because even though it looked great in Chicago Heights in the Petri dish, it's never going to scale. It's never going to work as well as what it did in Chicago Heights. So at that moment, I started to think about this kind of feature of scaling and how it's been part of my life for a long time. And I went back to 20 years ago when I worked in the White House. We had ideas, and the common theme was, will it scale? It works in New Jersey, will it go to Minneapolis? It worked in Minneapolis, will it go to Newark or wherever? When I looked around Uber and thought about the innovation that was happening at Uber, it was also, will it scale? So I started to write academic papers about scaling and scalability, because back then, this is around 2014, 2015. So I start doing academic work. And at that moment, there was a lot of art. It was move fast and break things. Basically, that was the genesis of your last question. Throw spaghetti against the wall, and whatever sticks, cook it. Or fake it till you make it. Right? That's literally what people in the business world always say. That's art. That's simply art. There's no evidence for any of that being true. So I thought, let's add some science to the art. And my science is behavioral science, it's economics. And it's adding scientific thinking to elements like, will it scale? So then when I start to think about the firms that I've worked with, let's talk about product firms, Sears and Kmart. Didn't work out for them, but that was like predictable that it wasn't going to work. But what I write about in the book is as applicable for them as it is for a restaurant, as it is for a service provider, as it is for Walmart, Citibank, any firm you think of, or a government or a nonprofit. There are features of ideas that put them in the camp of, it's got a shot. It's got a shot to scale. And there are other features that if you don't have them, got no shot. Or at least if you scale it, the tent's going to be a lot smaller than what you probably think. So I think that's what led me to write the book. Now, so I write these academic papers and I get the sense of nobody's reading them. So my guess is, Eric and Ted, neither of you have read one of my academic papers on scaling.
Maybe a highlight or two.
You may have read the abstract if somebody told you about the abstract. That's the issue, right? Now that's the issue. Look, I love being an academic. I love science. But the issue is there are so many great secrets and so many great insights that are locked in economic social science, hard science journals, academic journals, they're locked. And unless people like yourselves, or in my case, a few times I've said, look, I'm going to lay stake here and I'm going to write what I've learned in the academic literature on scaling. I'm going to write a popular book because I want people to learn about these ideas. It's the same thing I did with the y-axis. With the y-axis, it was along the lines of, I've been doing field experiments for 20 years. I want to let the world know why field experiments are important. In this particular case, when you think about implementation or you think about scaling, it's the most important feature we have today to change the world. Because we have a lot of good ideas that have been solved in the Petri dish. A lot of great Petri dish ideas. But those ideas don't have a shot to scale. And we don't have ideas that can scale because in the academic community, in the scientific creation, knowledge creation market, we don't have the incentives set up yet to have people test, will that idea scale? But I hope my book, in part, which takes kind of the economies out of the academic journals, takes the math out, and now is getting some attention that the academic papers wouldn't have gotten. So that's really why I wrote the book.
Well, let's stay with that, John. So in the voltage effect, and now I'm quoting you, you say every scalable idea is the same, every unscalable idea is unscalable in its own way. Can you tell us more about this? And perhaps as a kind of handy tip with our attendees kind of in mind, what could they look out for indications of what might be scalable or some kind of red flags to signal unscalable?
Yeah, okay, that's very good. So you have just channeled my inner Tolstoy. So okay, right. I know that this. I know for you, not being from Wisconsin, that this is high level stuff. But let me bring you home here. Bring you to Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. So you have this little kid in the mid '80s. John List is sitting, reading Anna Karenina. So Anna Karenina, I think, has one of my favorite lines of all time. It's for sure the best opening line in a novel ever written. So Tolstoy says, happy families are all alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. You're like, okay. But what have I really learned from this? Because Tolstoy has what an economist would call a dimensionality problem. Because look, I have 8 kids, and there are an infinite number of ways that my family is unhappy. Right? And so Tolstoy doesn't really get us anywhere.
Sounds like a lot of ways things can go wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. Like too many ways, right? There's so many ways that you don't learn. It's like disequilibrium analysis in economics. Okay. So now let's come to scaling. So you're right. What I say is scalable ideas are all alike. Each unscalable idea is unscalable in its own way. But I pinpoint 5 reasons why ideas don't scale. And that's what I call the 5 vital signs. So if you think about ideas or entrepreneurship in like the 2 buckets that I was thinking about, first of all, do I have an idea that can scale? Those are the 5 vital signs. I talked there about false positives. I talk about understanding the extent of market. I talk about, is your evidence of its efficacy in a situation that is representative of the situation you're going to face at scale? Something that the 2 of you talk about all the time is, can we generalize from one setting to another? So in the Chicago Heights example, I only had to hire 30 teachers, but at scale, I might have to hire 30,000. If teachers are the important element back here in the Petri dish, did I test my idea for the types of teachers that I'm going to have to hire at scale? No, we don't. What we do is we hire 30 really good teachers to give our idea its best shot. That's not a test of scale. That's a test of Petri dish efficacy. Okay? So that's the third vital sign, is make sure that your non-negotiables, the features that make your idea work, make sure they're available at scale. The fourth vital sign is understand spillovers. So this is in the behavioral scientists quiver over and over again, that We move somebody, we give them an incentive, and they react to that incentive, but sometimes there's a behavioral rebound effect. In economics a long time ago, it's called the Peltzman effect. People wearing seatbelts drive more aggressively, so they undo some of the seatbelt effect. Now, you also have unintended consequences, spillovers, a new equilibria, if you will, so market-wide spillovers. So I talk a lot about the different kinds of spillovers that ideas have. On the positive side, you can think about Facebook, network externalities. Facebook did look very good in the small, right? If none of your friends are on Facebook or family, it's not very valuable to you. But as more and more people pick up Facebook, it has this great feature called network externalities. And the value of Facebook grows as more people join. So that's something that in the Petri dish may not have looked great. But if you understood, once you have adoption, now you're going to have these great features and we're going to have high voltage at scale. So that tells you want to give a lot of incentives to get people to adopt and be early adopters and spread the word. So that's vital sign number 4, is understanding spillovers. And vital sign number 5 is the supply side. So your business audience is going to know this, and they'll probably say, what took John so long to get here? Because when I talk to business types, they usually start with the supply side. And they start with the supply side for good reason, because they say, look, if this has good features, supply side features, economies of scale, that's good because I know I'm going to have to go down the demand curve eventually. And that when I go down the demand curve, people have a lower willingness to pay. So I need to be picking up cost advantages. And when I pick up cost advantages, that might serve as a market barrier, a barrier to entry. Because if I get to the bottom of my long run average total cost curve, I'm going to be killing it. Think about Amazon or Walmart. They have a lot of volume and a lot of different products, and that helps them get a lower cost per unit versus a new entrant who might just be starting up as a grocer or as a general merchandiser. So these aspects are important as well. Does the feature of your idea serve yourself well on the supply side? So that's really the first half of the voltage effect, is figuring out, does your idea have these 5 vital signs? If it doesn't, it's okay. You might still want to scale it, but just understand that the tent isn't going to be as big as it could be unless you address one of those flaws. So the notion is, okay, let's just say that it's extent of market. It's a really tiny piece of the pie I can get. It's time to think about product differentiation or some features where you can get a bigger piece of the pie. And a lot of times, like I mentioned, people overestimate the size of the pie or the available market because of things like confirmation bias and what happened to the McDonald's CEO.
So I want to ask you one more question, John, before I hand it back to Eric. And I asked something very similar of Cass in this morning session as well. With our audience in mind, many of whom are passionate about behavioral science and nudging, but working in a corporate or commercial organizations where there may not yet be a specific budget or team for applying behavioral science, how would you encourage them to make those early moves of incorporating or applying behavioral science in their work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a hard question. The way that I've thought about it in my orgs is I've really gone to the roots and I've thought about critical thinking. And what I mean by that is at Lyft, the way I managed, and at Uber, the way I managed is I tried to give my team good critical thinking skills. So I developed a playbook. Now you might say, well, how does John define critical thinking? Because critical thinking is like culture and like creativity. If you ask 30 people, you'll get 25 different definitions. Okay, so I think about critical thinking in 2 ways. One, an abstract formulation of theory of mind and getting beyond egocentrism. That's one part of critical thinking. The other part is being an empiricist and understanding how to generate data and interpret data and make inference from data. So I develop a little playbook for my workers to be systematic critical thinkers, because within critical thinking will be behavioral science. The behavioral science really is how do people behave. It's positive economics, if you will. Now, you might say, well, John, this sounds like a secret book. I actually took that to the classroom, and I wrote a paper that's titled Getting Fast Thinkers to Slow Down. And then I develop a critical thinking hierarchy in that paper. So all of your listeners could go and get this paper for free. If you type in John List, Getting Fast Thinkers to Slow Down, you'll see my critical thinking hierarchy. It goes from like the modal thinker to the neophyte to adapt and great thinker. And I talk about ways that we can teach our employees how to go up the critical thinking pyramid. Now you can say, well, how does that have to do with behavioral science? Because as you develop critical thinking skills, an important feature of that is behavioral science, because it's putting yourself in the shoes of others and figuring out how are they thinking about the problem? What are their behavioral heuristics? And how, when we have a certain kind of incentive, how do they respond and why? And when you start to think like that, you develop a totally different culture around using behavioral science. And then from that, you say, look, let's try this nudge. And if you try this nudge, whether it's a social norm nudge, a framing nudge like loss aversion, or default or whatever, to sell that, you say, look, that's just part of the nexus of critical thinking. And what we've learned in the critical thinking hierarchy is why we should do those nudges. Now, a lot of people will jump right to the nudge and say, just do a simple nudge and show how valuable it is. Show them how important defaults are and show them how people will save more or work more with the default. I found that when you teach a person to fish, rather than just give them fish, even after you leave, they will continue fishing. And I think it's a fundamental cultural change about the way we think through problems in both a behavioral science or critical thinking realm and also a data is our DNA realm. Data is our DNA, so we're going to always generate data because that's our culture. At Uber and Lyft, that was the culture. If you had an idea or argument, you brought data. If you didn't bring data, don't come. And firms need to get used to that you bring behavioral science. Behavioral science helps you generate data, and then together they lead to better decisions. And that's
right where I think we are with the industry, is that, if the first 10 years, let's say, of kind of commercial application of behavioral science has been getting people's attention through nudges, where we need to be careful now is the clients say, bring me the nudges, instead of saying, let's get your team, let's get elements of your business to think about behavioral science and all that means, understanding context, understanding heuristics, understanding biases. The nudges are the great output potentially, but there's some heavy lifting to do, I think, as an industry. Eric, I need to pass it back to you.
So thanks so much, John. I was sure it would be an amazing conversation. Thank you, Ted, too, for the good question. It was really fantastic. Maybe a final question from my side. What is the one piece of advice you would give to Chief Innovation Officer who would like to start applying behavioral science to their work?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the last question and say that's the long-term investment. That's the planting of a seed that might grow into a great oak tree. Now in the short run, we need wins. I always think about when I start working with an organization, I want to use your existing data. And I want to use your existing data to show you how we can get short-term wins and small wins to show you that you should trust me. Now, I do that as a chief economist. I say, okay, what data do we have lying around that I can analyze better than anyone else can, and I can bring behavioral insights that nobody else has. We all have unique behavioral insights. So I would say start with the small win, and then you do want to build up the muscle. And when I walked in Uber for the first time, I'll never forget the sign that I saw on the pillar. Data is our DNA. And a lot of firms have slogans. And the slogans are just jargon or things that make people feel good. That wasn't the case at Uber. Data is literally your DNA. And these small wins for the chief innovation officer, the chief economist, whoever is pushing behavioral science in the firm, these small wins lead up to this overarching culture of behavioral science and data. Those are our DNA. And then that is what will stick with a firm. Right now, there's a big dichotomy between old and young. And what I see with newer firms, whether it's Scale AI, Amazon, Uber, Lyft, Facebook, Google, data's a DNA. Behavioral science is the DNA. Behavioral science is a driver. The older firms, I think it's adapt or die. I think many firms are on the endangered species list because they're not adapting to the new world of data. Now, a lot of times here, people say data is the world's greatest resource. It's not. It's the data refiners. It's people who can refine the data and use behavioral science to learn about what are the lessons and what can we take from the data to make our decisions better. Everyone has data. Everyone in the world has mounds and mounds of data. I can get mounds and mounds of data this afternoon by scraping. It's the data refiners, and that's the behavioral scientists and the people who understand how to go from data to decision making. And a ton of that's behavioral science. Have good data refiners around you is what. So I'm building a team right now at Walmart, and it will work if I can hire good data refiners. So that's sort of a way to think about changing the culture. Eric, I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's a wonderful conversation. So thanks a lot again, John. We appreciate you spending your time with us and sharing your great expertise. It was really great for all of our audience.
No, thanks so much for having me, Eric and Ted. And I'll deal with you later, my friend. The Packers are coming up in the new season. No, it's true. It's always fun to banter. It's like this morning when I woke up and looked at my calendar. This was like the highlight of my day. I know I live a pretty boring life, but Ted, it was great chatting, and Eric and Ted, keep doing this. This is great stuff. And anytime you'd like me to come back, love to come back. It's always great to chat with both of you.
Great. Thanks, John. So for our attendees, stay tuned and logged in. We're headed into the next session where we're going to discuss developing new products with System 1 in mind. And later this afternoon, we'll be talking cities and mobility, fast-moving consumer goods, and more. We will see you there.
Enough of that abuse. I didn't deserve that, I feel. But anyway.
I don't know if you feel the same, but each time we listen to John, we think we are smarter. This guy is absolutely incredible, engaging, and so smart, so experienced, being an academic and at the same time chief economist at Walmart now. And he didn't tell you that he was at the beginning, not exactly at the beginning of the career, at the middle of his career, chief economist at the White House. So a quite broad experience. So now we start our new round table with great experts in innovation, starting with Pierrick here. Pierrick Rivière, who is group leader for product performance evaluation at a small group, L'Oréal. Stefan Donaszewski. Good point for me to have well pronounced his name, Stefan, who was the Chief Behavioral Science Officer at Kellogg's and an expert in the application of behavioral science to innovation. And we welcome also Piyush Tantia. Piyush is the Chief Innovation Officer at IDs 42.
So this roundtable will be moderated by Carlos Gallardo, who's the Vice President of Innovation and Forecasting at our sister agency, PRS and Vivo. And as you know well by now, Carlos is going to lead us in 30 minutes of discussion with our speakers. You can send your questions into the live chat. Then Carlos will select some of them and ask of the panel. Take it away, Carlos.
Yes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for attending those who are connecting remotely. The presentations have been done, so we can start directly. So I'm going to start with you, Pierre. So the first question is, based on your experience and on your background, in what way do you think can behavioral science improve innovation processes in FMCG? And if you had an example to share with us also to illustrate this.
So first of all, I would like to thank all the organization staff, and especially Eric and Etienne to inviting me. Regarding your question, yes, what behavioral science can bring to innovation process, I think behavioral science is about user centricity. It can boost user centricity. And also, yes, it can really sorry. Yeah, and especially for disruptive innovation, because and what I mean by disruptive innovation is innovation that implies people to change their routine. And in the beauty market, for example, there are two big shifts that is coming, which is the green sciences, as we already talked about in the sustainable topic. Green sciences is a new paradigm to formulate product in a more sustainable way. And the other big shift will be beauty tech. How we will not only provide formula, but also services that will enhance the consumer experience with your smartphone or with other connected devices. And behavioral science will be of great help to ensure sustainable adoption of this disruptive innovation, and mainly with in three ways. Because first, behavioral science will help a better definition of the behavioral challenge. It's really important to set the right ambition for the right consumers. If I take the example, for example, of water consumption under shower, how can we decrease water consumption under shower? And maybe it's better to doing step by step than asking consumer to do it brutally, even if the technical solution exists. Because when you evolve in the innovation area, you have a lot of engineers that have great ideas and they have the solution, but is this solution will be relevant for consumers, and how much does it push the consumers to change their habits? That's why we are here, in fact. And the second step also is behavioral science can help you to better understand all the friction we discussed before. What are the potential barriers of adoption? And it gives you clear lens of how behavioral science will give you a lens to better identify where are the friction. And then I think behavioral science, with all the learnings on the cognitive bias and so on, and it will give you very useful tips and also example on how to design consumer experience that will take into consideration system 1 and system 2, so rational and irrational thinking. And this is really important because I come from an industry where it is really tech push, so we are quite rational, but we have to take into account also for more irrational behavior toward innovation. And it's not because it works objectively or in theory that it will work in real life. And behavioral science will help us to do that, to have a more holistic point of view of how the consumer will adopt your innovation or not.
Thank you very much. So now, Piyush, the same question to you. In what way can behavioral science improve innovation processes in FMCG? And an example of that, if you have some to share with us.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I agree with everything that Pierre was just saying. That's fantastic. What I might add is something different. I'll go into how we discover needs in the first place and understand consumer behavior in the first place, right? We're very used to doing surveys, talking to people, interviewing them. That's very, very useful, of course. But a lot of the times, the things that people are telling you is a post hoc kind of justification, or because you asked the question, they're reflecting back on why they did something and then giving you an answer that they think you want to hear. Right? And from behavioral science, we know a lot of ways to get at needs and behaviors that are not only reliant on self-report. So there's a study that I love. It's very, very old, decades old. This illustrates this point of biased self-report. So they bring subjects into a room and they see two ropes hanging from the ceiling, right? And they're quite far apart, so they can't reach the ropes if they just stretch their arms out. And they're told that they have to figure out how to tie the ropes together. And there are various tools and so on lying around, and none of it works. So people struggle with this. Then the experimenter kind of walks through the room casually and bumps into one of the ropes. So the rope starts swinging. Okay, and now the subjects figure out the solution almost immediately. They say, oh, we can make a pendulum out of one of the ropes. So it's swinging. They hold on to the second rope. When the pendulum gets close to them, they can now grab it and they can tie the two ropes together. Now, if you ask people, how did you solve the problem? They come up with all sorts of stories. They'll say, oh, I remembered this grandfather clock in the house I grew up in, and that made me think of the pendulum idea. Very few subjects say, oh, well, it's because you walked through the room and bumped the rope. Right, so this is a very key process point, and goes to what John List was also talking about, is you can't rely on what people tell you all the time. You have to test. You can run lab studies. The insights for a need may come from something totally different, right? So I love the example of small sachets of shampoo being sold at bottom of the pyramid markets, because that need of people not having enough cash at one time came from research on financial services and financial health. So you have to look more broadly, and behavioral science can give you some of these pointers.
Great, thank you. So now, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. I completely agree with what everybody said before. There's a whole series of different things that behavioral science kind of brings to innovation. I mean, I think that first point that was raised was about the ethos of it. Becoming consumer-centric, becoming interested in the consumer as part of this, knowing what they want as well as what they need, thinking about it from that point of view. The second point is obviously research, bringing better research techniques to be able to understand people and understand how people use products and what people are actually doing and why they're doing it, and how whatever you're doing might help them better. The third obvious area is around design, and I think we've not really talked too much about human-centered design, but within CPG, I think it's very important. I think understanding all the different things, for example, that we put on the pack and how we design that pack to work has been completely changed. So not just the product, not just the supply side of things as well, but actually just understanding the totality of it and how it works for people. And you need different methods to do that. I think that's the fourth point, which is how do you evaluate these things? And I think behavioral science has been really helpful in thinking about ways of that. And the last thing that I think everybody's touched on, which to me is really important, is the internal change side of things. When you work with engineers and scientists, everybody really wants a rational approach. And I mean, it's interesting that actually behavioral science provides a rational justification for why things aren't always as they might expect. And I think that actually, when it comes down to it, is quite often the biggest impact I've seen is when we look at it from an internal point of view and justifying the different ways we do things. I mean, 10 years ago, research seemed to be fairly simple in so much that you either did qual, in which case it's probably a focus group, or you did quant and sent out a survey, in which case, realistically, you probably got an agency to do it or you did it yourself. I think understanding that isn't the best way of understanding things, that people can't always tell you the answers or won't always tell you the answers, depending on which way we want to look at it, or maybe a combination of the two, is really important. Understanding how people play and interact with things, much more along the experimental approaches that you can use. Because in many ways, actually, it's quite interesting, and touching on the sort of previous session, there is often a cost implication and a speed implication, because you're getting people to change processes that they've used for quite a long time. You're getting people to change internally the norms that they've always used as accepting, or they've always accepted. I mean, if you ask people, for example, about all the traditional stage gates and methodologies, they find it really simple because they've always used it. When you start challenging and pushing people to think about things in a different way, it makes things much harder for those people. And so, if you're thinking about it from a systems 1, systems 2 point of view, pushing them from one aspect to the other is always quite hard. And that doesn't necessarily, that applies as much internally as it does to consumers. If we're developing something that's radically different and new, consumers find it much harder than people internally within an organization do. But actually helping people within the organization understand that at the end of the day, it's going to be very complicated for reasons that aren't completely rational, and aren't completely the same ones that they would have themselves. And just sort of demonstrating the different pressures and different drivers of people's behavior is I think, probably one of the best things that behavioral science, or the best ways I've seen behavioral science being able to help. Because unless you manage that challenge internally, it's really hard to change the process. And if you can't change anything in terms of what you're doing internally, it makes it almost impossible to apply that behavioral science to the design and creation of new products.
Thank you, and happy to hear that you all agree that we need to test and test more. So now we go to the next question, and we're going to go back to you, Piyush. How to diffuse behavioral science within innovation processes, especially within large organizations, sometimes multinational companies that can add an additional layer of complexity.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've been reflecting on this. I think the key, of course, starts with understanding behavioral science insights in the first place, right? But it's not reading the research papers or even reading the popular books, right? That can give you this impression that behavioral science gives you a set of 10 prepackaged solutions you can go apply everywhere. And many of the frameworks out there sound like that. Oh, here's a list, you can use social norms, you can make things easy. It's not actually that at all. What the science is really telling you, if you read it differently, is how elements of the situation, or context, as we call it, affect behavior, right? And that's what you have to extract from the science, because that is what makes it useful for design and for business. So, for example, we know many of us maybe read about choice overload. Oh, too much choice is bad. Well, okay, but specific features matter. So in some situations, it's going to be too many options. In other situations, it's going to be few options, but options that are difficult to compare with each other. Both of those are going to cause you a choice overload issue. Okay, but you have to figure out which one is happening in your situation, or is it both? And depending on which one is happening, the design is going to be different. If it's too many options, you might use a recommendation engine or categorization. If it's hard to compare, then you might change how you present the options and give people a criterion to compare them by, or again, use recommendations. So that's the piece you have to integrate. So the two things that you really have to integrate, I think, into any innovation process to use behavioral science. One is this knowledge, right, of the science, and then understanding the situation before you start designing things. So plug that into the process. And then second, we've talked about, which is testing and experimentation. Right? And it doesn't matter which process you're plugging this into. But I've now come to the conclusion that there isn't one amazing process or methodology out there. But use whatever your team is comfortable with already. If it's design thinking of a certain kind, then great. If it's something else, great. But it's these two elements that you plug in. Like understand the situation using behavioral science and then test.
Thank you, Piyush. So now, Stephen, back to you, same question. How to diffuse behavioral science within innovation processes in large companies?
Okay, I'm probably going to be slightly controversial here and say I don't think that large companies need an awful lot, very many behavioral scientists at all. In my experience of working, and this isn't just Kellogg, this is all the big businesses I've ever worked in, is that we used to start with an approach of training people to understand a lot about what behavioral science is, what it does, how you think about it, how you think about the person in context, how you actually work through it. And what we tended to find in a number of different organizations, and this is just a generalization, is that if you train people in behavioral science, they suddenly become a lot more employable. And so if you're not careful, they just go off and get themselves another job at a higher wage. And before you know it, they come back and do your job for you. So actually, it's a case of saying, well, what is it that we actually do? And one of the really important things, as was just been mentioned, is thinking about the context, the environment in which we sit. And I think that I completely agree that I'm not dogmatic in any way, shape, or form about the process. And whatever process is most convenient, and whether it's a stage gate process or whatever, the fact that you can then start to design and build in behavioral steps within it. So make as few changes as you possibly can, but actually just change the process and use the process as the thing, the environmental nudge, if you want to think about it, the intervention with the team to mean that they talk to either behavioral scientists or behavioral agencies or whoever it is that you're working with, but that they start to use it in the right kind of way. And I'm very keen that actually, you change as little as possible, because then you make it as easy for them to carry on with the process as they can, or as you possibly can do, and you only change the vital aspects to it. I've worked with, a number of brilliant nutrition scientists and food scientists, and the idea of getting rid of them and replacing them with behavioral scientists and then training those people to do food or nutrition is completely ridiculous. In the same kind of way that they don't need a huge amount of training. What they need is almost the process and the context around them to enable them to use other people and other types of things better, quicker, and more easily. And that's what I've kind of been working on over the last couple of years, is moving very much away from the idea that we need to train everybody. Because, I look around and the amount of behavioral science training out there is enormous. And I kind of get to the end of it and, you still end up with questions like, well, what have I done this for? Whereas actually when you start designing it into the processes for people just go through, they understand it, they use it. And the more they play and use behavioral science, the more it becomes second nature to them and the better they're able to build. And I think that this is a really different, well, it's been my practical learning, shall we put it that way. Does that answer the question?
Yes, definitely. Thanks. Now, Pierrick, maybe you also can talk about what you've done.
So I strongly agree with what has already been said, but from what I experienced today at L'Oréal, so we have the chance that since 2 or 3 years ago now, human science is a key competencies for L'Oréal for all the collaborators in R&I. So we have the responsibility to train all the people in R&I in human science and behavioral science. And for that, so how we did it and how we are doing it, because we are starting the journey also. First, I think we need a small group of experts, not too many, but I think a small, just to set the scene, and as said, John, set a proper framework that is relevant to the company's tech, because we don't have the same problematics from one company to another, and also run some proof of concept to make sure that it's relevant. And then what we put in place with this small group is a learning program. So I agree that we need at some point to explain what is behavioral science, because sometimes it can be a little bit mysterious, it's a new science and so on. So we need at least to explain the main principles. But formal learning is not enough for me, and for sure we need to pay attention to coach people on their job, how to apply behavioral science in their project, and I think for me it's quite key, and this is what we are trying to do with this small group. We are going in the project and try to apply sometimes some theoretical concept from behavioral science, like I like very much, for example, the HAC effect. Where people put more value when they partially created the object. So, okay, it's nice learnings, but how can I apply it to my project, and what does it mean? And depending on the project, you will not come up with the same solution. And that's also one typicity of behavioral science. It's a tailor-made approach. You need to go deeper in your problematic, understand your consumer, your context, your situation, and then try to think how this concept can apply to your solution. And this is a difficult point, how to make sure that people will apply this theory on the day-to-day job. And so that's why this coaching part, to learn by doing, is really, really, really important. And then we are much focusing our effort on today.
Great, thank you. So sounds easy. So last question. So I'm going to head it back to you, Stephen. And it was also the last question of the previous interview. What would you recommend to a chief innovation officer that has just started? Any traps to avoid? How can they use and benefit from behavioral science broadly?
Wow. Okay. So firstly, I'd wait until they'd embedded themselves for a bit before recommending anything. As in my experience, it takes a lot of people coming in as a new innovation officer. They're going to have ideas that they want to do, and so going straight up to them is probably not the best thing in my experience. I'm sure we can explain it behaviorally. What would I actually genuinely recommend that they did? I'd recommend that they start thinking about all the different areas they can, and possibly, as they will want to, tweaking the process just to make sure that the key areas we use of interest, looking at a change to being more behavioral. So that might be the research techniques that they use, what primary research we're running, where and why. It might be some of the internal thinking systems that are used, the ways people talk and think. We know that workshops are quite often really bad ways of creating new ideas, but really good ways of getting decisions to be verified. So understanding the pros and cons of what they're actually doing internally, and just building on it and adding to it. I would say that they should encourage people to learn more and learn different ways of thinking about things. Back to the original sort of points that were raised very early on, which is, okay, so what does this actually mean in practice for us? How do we best actually think about it? Look at the new research techniques, look then at the design, and not just bringing it in wholesale, because I think, as the previous, in fact, as we've all probably talked about, it's not worth applying general theory willy-nilly to everything. You've got to be very specific in terms of what it means and when it's there, and not taking just simple principles and practice and assuming that they will all apply to everything. Looking at the barriers, looking at the triggers, understanding it from a human-centric point of view, testing more as you go through the process and evaluating properly. having said that, I'd probably have to chunk all of that down and only recommend one bit at a time. So I'd probably start with talking about the ethos.
Thank you, Stephen. So now, Pierrick, also, if you could share with us.
Yes, so as I said before, I think there is no one-fits-all solution in behavioral science. So you need to understand, each time it's a tailor-made approach. You need to understand, as said, you need to understand what are the barriers, what is at stake in your innovation. So this is my first message. And the second one is to encourage breaking silos, because behavioral science is about also designing consumer experience. And consumer experience is we need to design it, we need to adopt also a more holistic point of view. Everyone, each person that is involved in this consumer experience at the end should be part of the innovation process. So we have to break silos. Marketing, sales, engineers, they have to work together to build this experience from the beginning. And yeah, my last message is start as early as possible, because, and not at the end. Don't say behavioral science. Okay, we will have a touch of behavioral science at the end and make sure that the innovation will be adopted. No, I think it's, as we said, it's about UX. It's about creating new experience. So this has to be start from the beginning with a clear intention, a clear ambition, and then you have to hold the people in the organization that have one part of the solution. They have to integrate the project team.
Thank you. And now back to Piyush. So also same question.
Sure. Yeah, I'll love everything that Stephen and Pierrick have said. So what I'll add to that, one is, building on what Stephen had said earlier, that when you train people in behavioral science, they find better jobs. I have definitely suffered the pain of that since Ideas 42 was one of the earliest groups doing this. We've lost a lot of people to Google and Meta, Weight Watchers, and various other companies. So yes, be prepared for a lot of recruiting and training all the time. But jokes apart, I think one thing I always find in companies, when I used to work with large companies in my consulting career, failure was not an option. If you ran a pilot, even though it was called a pilot or a test, you had to be certain that it would succeed, which makes no sense. If you're doing innovation, by definition, you're trying a bunch of things that may not work to reach then something new that will work, right? So you have to set that expectation and start to move that culture a bit slowly and before you start doing things, because you will have some failures. Things will not go as planned because that's what you're trying to do. The second is I find that when people do the typical kind of brainstorming, someone will pick an idea kind of judgmentally out of that process and then decide to implement it. And there are a lot of behavioral reasons why you might love an idea that you came up with it. Well, you came up with it, so you kind of like it. You had this little emotional burst in your brain when the idea pops in your head, and that makes you feel good about it. You see that idea over and over again. It's the mere exposure effect. You start liking it. So don't trust your instinct entirely. Right? Often your instinct is going to be right from experience, but you have to unpack that from some of these other effects that could be going on what to choose, what to prioritize. So try to use as much data, information, as many different perspectives as you can when you choose what to prioritize to try out.
Thank you. So thank you to the three of you for sharing these very interesting insights and your experience. So now I think we can ask some questions to people that are here in Paris. Are there any questions? Don't be shy.
Hi, I have a question for Pierrick. You said something really interesting at the very end. Start early, that don't just add a touch of behavioral science at the end. I'm really curious if you could tell a bit more about that, because that's been kind of the bane of my professional life for 10 years. As a consultant, more often than not, that's a question of like, can you just add a bit of behavioral science at the end? It's like, no, you're too late now, but so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Alors, it's true in behavioral science, but it's true in general in innovation, because the more there is people that join the team and say, oh, why have you think like that? I think this idea could be is not good. Follow my idea. So what is important is having the right stakeholder all together at the beginning of the project to make sure that all the people who has some insight to provide, they have to be there for sure. And then regarding the start as early as possible, it's also about it's design principle. Let's say we are not so used to say that when we want to design something, an innovation, we should start with an intention. Why do you have this proposition? How do you expect your consumer will react to this proposition? Behavioral science is about anticipating how consumers will interact with your product. And if you don't do that at the beginning, you will cut off you cut off yourself from technical flexibility also, because the more you have think about it at the beginning, the more you have flexibility to find some alternatives, and the more also you have great ideas coming from different stakeholders. So I think for me it's really important to start at the very beginning to have the opportunity to set your hypothesis, have different alternatives, and then test it, and to find what is your optimum solution. But yeah.
Do you have any other question? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Also for Pierrick, I'm just wondering if internally with the teams that you work with, are there any barriers when it comes to putting into place behavioral science practices, and how have you overcome that?
I would say yes and no. I would say no, because I think we have the chance through actors like today that behavioral science it's a hype today, so we are on good vibes with this domain. So everyone heard about system 1, system 2. So all these notions are really popular now, and people are really curious about that. So I think we have an audience, a large audience, more than larger than we think, in fact. And then, as I said before, the main barriers for me, it's about make it concrete. Because, for example, for L'Oréal, we develop a specific framework that is relevant to the beauty market and beauty solution. And to set this framework, I have to read about 18 articles to say which one is relevant for my case. So I think there is also space to make things more tangible, things more easy also to adopt. We need to walk the talk in this domain, and there is a lot of great things, and John Lees with his popular book also help us a lot to make it concrete. But yes, I think there is a step, and also and adapt to each category, because as we said, it's very dependent. Each problem is very dependent of your category. The beauty category has specific problem, food category has very specific problem, and solution will be tailor-made, as I said.
Thank you.
So now we have some questions here that are here on the screen. So what is the minimum package of behavioral science skills and tools is necessary to create the spark in teams not versed in behavioral science. So maybe Stephen, Piyush, you can try to answer.
Sorry, the question is, what's the minimum level of skills that people need?
Yes, to create the spark in teams not versed in behavioral science.
Okay, so I think that there are two different ways you can answer this question. The first one is about sort of knowledge sharing in education and trying to inspire people who know nothing about behavioral science to be interested in behavioral science is a role in itself. I think in terms of applying behavioral science in a practical way to the situation, what roles do you, or what tools do you actually need? I'd say partly you need tools which are about the understanding of actually the ethos of behavioral science, because I think it's really important to say that it's a practice. So I think that often when people have a very specific and narrow viewpoint, they're less useful in helping teams, because I mean, I've helped teams in everything from many different research methodologies and finding out what those are. So looking at the insight side of it to looking at the process side of it, and they're very different skills. So if you are a classic behavioral science experimenter, then you don't have all of those skills. So you need people who have a wider range of more general behavioral science skills, if that makes sense, an understanding of a wide range of models. An understanding of what they actually mean. In many ways, I think being able to learn and understand when to bring in specific experts, because at different times you will be able to apply things from, so many different kinds of psychology, for example, from organizational psychology through to social psychology. You'll be using people who are sociologists or anthropologists. You'll be looking at various different forms of change. So being able to understand the breadth, I think, is very important. And having people who have those skills rather than narrower, more in-depth skills in terms of, for example, running, being able to design and run experiments and RCTs and various things along those lines. I think those people play a really important part, but that's when it comes down to the more practical implementation rather than the design and inspiring stage.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, building on it, the instinct is to go out and hire a PhD scientist. Right? Oh, let's get somebody with a PhD in psychology. They're going to infuse behavioral science into the team. That's not what they were trained for. They were trained for generating new knowledge, and they do that in a very, very, very narrow area that they have expertise in, that they do research in. So actually what you need is that breadth and the ability to translate to business outcomes and get people sort of excited about it. Right. We haven't made it easy, so I'll take some responsibility for it in building this field out. It takes too long still to give people that broad training. There aren't really good classes out there and trainings yet. We have introductory ones, but we don't have the next level one. And that is something, in fact, we've talked to Eric and the BBA folks a lot about and trying to develop that. So it is something coming. We also are working on standards that'll specify some of this. So yeah, more to come.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again for talking to us and having the time to speak to our audience. Now I'm going to head it back to Eric and Ted.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.
I think the hardest working man in Paris today might be Adrien, so I think we'll have them share the sketch note up on the screen when you can to the tech team. And thanks so much to our panel. I think it was really interesting to hear Stephen talking about understanding the context before we start to put behavioral science into a team, and starting early, as Pierre said, and also this idea of test and learn instead of behavioral science being applied so late in the game. So instead of test and learn, it's kind of make it work is sometimes what clients and organizations think. And so I think we're ready to head into our next session.
Yeah, we are very lucky to have a closing not for this innovation session, but before launching this session with this conversation with Matt Valaert, two advice. First, read The Voltage Effect by John List. It's really wonderful. And if you are very excited, read his first book, The Y-Axis. And second, go to visit the IDs42 website, which is a wonderful source of knowledge with great white papers. But now, Matt Valaert.
Yeah. So Matt is interviewed by Emily Boots, who is the head of the BVA Data Factory, and she is one of our champions for innovation at BVA. And so we'll have Emily take it away.
Hi everyone, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for the closing conversation of the Innovation and New Ideas session at the Human Advantage Conference. Now, Emily Boots, who is head of BVA Data Factory and one of the BVA's group champion for innovation, and myself will be speaking with Matt Valaert. For almost 20 years, Matt Valaert has been applying behavioral science to practical problems. Matt has been the first director of behavioral science at Microsoft, a small company. After leaving academia, his career as an executive led from startups to the Fortune 500 and back again, before joining Frog, which is a Capgemini company, as the head of behavioral science, where he focuses on helping organizations build their own applied behavioral science capabilities. And I think you have created something very new in this area while building with the Frog team. In his book, because Matt has also published a book, Start at the End, and other writing, as well as hundreds of talks from the UN, another small organization, to SXSW, Matt details how the cycle of behavioral strategy, insight, design, and impact evaluation can help us build products and services that change behavior. So Matt is clearly the perfect speaker to end our session on innovation. So welcome, Matt. A big thank you for being with us today. We are very excited to have you at the Human Advantage Conference. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm super happy to be here.
Hi, Matt. So my first question, not very surprisingly, is about new product design. Why do you think that the typical process, the typical product design process that we have in place leads kind of constantly to failures? Do you think that, it's something that we could change with behavioral science?
I mean, I have spent the last 20 years of my life in behavioral science, so I have a bias, and I can acknowledge this bias, which is, of course, I think I could change it with behavioral science. I think, it's hard to say where the typical behavioral design or sort of the current product design process falls down, in part because I'm not sure we know what typical means. When I work with companies, it's very surprising to me how different companies are making products. I think if you think of product design in sort of two halves, in terms of, build the right thing and build the thing right. I think we've made a lot of progress on the build the thing right side. We know more about technical product management than probably we ever have. We're very good at producing things. We know how to get engineers to do things in an efficient way. Like, we're good at making things. We have good testing facilities for doing things like usability, etc. Where I think we're falling down is the build the right thing side. A lot of what we decide to build is unfortunately just the idea of an executive who decides that that's the right answer, and with very little evidence says, this is what we're going to do, right? Unfortunately, those executives are often older, often male, often white, right? And those decisions are made relatively in isolation, right? They're making the decision based on inputs rather than sort of, a collective decision-making process. And so I think that leads to, a bunch of products that are made by or ideated by a group of people who are wealthy and white and male and older. And, you know, when that hits the market, who's not all wealthy and older and white and male and an executive in a company, there's some failures there.
Yeah, I guess that's why it explains also that massive advertising campaigns are not really helping.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you make a terrible cake, you can put all the icing you want on it, but the cake is still terrible.
So I've read your book, great book, by the way. You came up with a new process that's called IDP, Intervention Design Process. Can you tell us about that? Can you tell us what are the steps and what actually behavioral science brings to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think to be clear, I have articulated a model for doing this. I think there's lots of models. I think we need more models. I think a plurality of models is good. I think what should unite all models is at the basis of behavioral science, right? Behavior is an outcome, science is a process. So we have to start from a place where we are articulating the behaviors that we want to create in the world at the end, right? The book is called Start at the End for a reason. We have to know where we want to arrive in an observable way. I talk to CEOs all the time who are like, I want people to love my product. I'm like, cool, what does that mean? Love can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Do you mean use the product, buy the product, recommend the product? All of those are different behaviors. What is it that you mean by that? So it's that articulation of behavior and then using a scientific method to do that. So at least in my process, we do that in 4 steps, right? We talk about strategy, right? And this is sort of that part where we work with stakeholders and business executives and other folks to understand what is it we actually want to do in the world. We use something called a behavioral statement. It's a pre-formatted statement when a target audience who has some limitations and a motivation wants to behavior, they will behavior as measured by data, right? So it's got a motivation and behavior. It's a very precise articulation of the world as we want it to exist in the world. Now, it seems people often look at this template and are like, I can fill that out in a snap. I don't think it's that easy. I actually think it's the hardest step in the whole process, is articulating what do we physically, literally want people to do? Data, which I know is your realm these days, is a really great example of that, right? We're like, we want people to make data-driven decisions. Cool, what does that mean, right? How would I even know that it happened? How would I measure it? How would I observe it? Who is doing it? Like when I say I want people to do it, who am I talking about, right? Why would they want to do that? What are the limitations to them doing that? So getting into that really precise articulation of strategy, I think is a big first step. Then we need to draw insights, right? I actually think science fiction is a lovely analogy for this, right? We have to imagine the world we want, and then we have to observe the world we have, right? We want to do that through quantitative and qualitative science, right? What we might think of as data science and user research. So we can understand the distance between these two worlds and why that distance exists. Then in the third step, we need to go into some kind of design process, right? So we need to understand, well, if these are the insights that we have, how are we going to use them to bridge the distance between the two? And our insights take a really specific format. One, why would anyone want to live in this alternative world? Why is that a better world than the world that we have today? And two, given that it's an attractive world, why don't we already live there? We talk about those as promoting pressures, things that make a behavior more likely, and inhibiting pressures, things that make a behavior less likely. So when we're designing, we don't actually design to change behavior. I can't pop open Eric's brain and find the love my product button and press it and magically it happens, right? That's not how science works. Instead, I modify the pressures in Eric's environment that then change his behavior. So it's changing pressures to change behavior. So we design for pressure change, and then we have to run a pilot. The hallmark of any good scientific process is experimentation. We need to try things at a variety of scales to gather the evidence we need to scale them. Many, many companies either don't run pilots at all or rush to very large pilots with very little evidence that those will work. And we end up in long 6-month cycles, wasting tens of millions of dollars on things that we ultimately are not going to launch. And so it's that small iterative process of piloting that we have to get good at as an industry. So for me, that's the 4 steps. It's behavior as an outcome, science as a process, using strategy, insights, design, and then some sort of experimentation or impact evaluation.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned Start at the End, and Start at the End is the name of the book, so it's really your main focus and your main point. Can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by that? And can you also maybe explain why you believe that putting behavior change first is really critical?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have a rush to solutioning. It is built into the modern business process that what is valued is the ideas for interventions, what we're actually going to do. But let's say that Eric is, the head of a seating company, and he says to me, Matt, he comes to Frog and he says, I want you to design a new chair. What he really means is that he wants to design something that will cause people to sit. And that seems like, well, Matt, okay, that's kind of a pedantic difference. But when we say, hey, I want to design something that causes people to sit, maybe it's not a chair. Maybe it's a beanbag. Maybe it's a bench. Maybe it's a yoga ball. Maybe it's a pair of anti-gravity pants where you just sort of lean back and make a sitting motion, right? When we start at the end, what we want, you actually can get to a wider range of solutions that are more inclusive, more interesting, more accessible, right? And that's why we need that end focus on a very specific behavior. What is it I actually physically, literally want people to do in the world, so that I then can come back to a set of solutions that are, I think, more diverse and more interesting. A lot of what we do when we start, other academics in the conference might have talked about anchoring bias, right? If I say, if I start you with the number 10, you're going to stay in the realm of 10. If I start you in the number 100, you're going to stay in the realm of 100. By starting at the end with the perfect, sort of in the world, if the world was exactly the way I want, what would be happening? We stretch farther, right? We're not starting from today and iterating forward. We're starting from what we want and iterating backwards. And that's a huge difference, right? Because, yeah, you might not actually achieve your ultimate goal, but you'll get a lot closer than if you started at what we have today.
And do you have, Matt, any example of a company who have followed this idea of starting at the end, focusing on behavior change?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are starting to get a better idea of how to pivot to this. We work with folks at Frog. It's been a fun journey at Frog getting folks to do this. One of the examples that I use in the book pretty consistently is Uber, right? Uber had a very clear articulation and understanding of the world that they wanted to create, which was a world where, sort of the majority of people didn't own cars and instead were taking other forms of transit that were owned by others. And, they have, for better or worse, sort of marched towards that place. Now, it's not an endorsement of Uber, right? Travis is a massive sexist, and I hope he loses all of his money. But they did have a very clear articulation and understanding of this is the kind of world that we want to create. We know what it's going to look like when we do it the right way, and they were very dogged in pursuing that with very little modification.
So I have one last question, and it's a bit of a, kind of like selfish question. As, the head of the Data Factory, I'm very kind of like focused on applying behavioral science and data science together. So I guess, my question is, do you believe that it is a winning strategy for new product design to combine both data science and behavioral science? And if you have any example that you could share with us, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of thoughts on data science. I mean, one of the cardinal sins to me in modern business is that data science and user research often live in different parts of the business and are uncoordinated with each other. As a scientist, I believe in combining quantitative insights, right, things we derive from data, with qualitative insights, things we can observe in the world from people, right? And that's been a hallmark of psychological science for 100 years, right? Much of what we think of as the modern scientific method evolved from people observing the world around them, observational science, and then moving to experimental science, which typically involves data. So I want to see those two brought closer together. I think insights has two really key places, at least in my articulation. One is in the insights phase. They really own that phase, right? They need to tell me what are the promoting and inhibiting pressures that are causing people to act the way that they do today, right? How can we observe the world today to understand why we're not in the ideal world, why we're still stuck here, right? And then two, I need them again in the last step, right? I need them to be able to tell me, do these pilots work? Where work means both something from a data perspective, but it also means something qualitative, right? You can get data that says, yeah, I got everybody to sit down, but they hate me and they hate the product. That's not where we want to go, right? We need that blend of quant and qual. And I think the other mistake that companies make is only engaging them on those two stages, right? I kick them out of the room during the design phase and I kick them out of the room during the business strategy phase. No, they need to be there the whole time. There's important context and there's important diversity of perspective that they bring. One of the companies I think does this fabulously well is one of my former employers, Clover Health, right? So I was chief behavioral officer at Clover Health, and they really invested early on in the company in the ability for everybody at the company to be data literate in a way that they could start to make and understand data-driven decision-making, right? So even if they weren't personally analyzing the data, they could understand at a core level the insights that were being given to them. This is really important. So you think about things like one of the projects I worked on there was flu shots, right? And if you asked an executive, well, how valuable do you think it is to the company if we get Eric to get a flu shot? Eric's one of our members. If I get Eric to get a flu shot, how much money do you think that either makes for the company in profit or at least reduces our hospitalization costs? And everybody's estimate was about $10. And when we went and did the work with the actuaries, actually it was a lot closer to $100, right? That's a huge difference, right? Because if I came to you, Emily, and you were the CEO of Clover, and I said, hey, I have an intervention, and for $50, I can get everybody to get a flu shot. Well, if you think flu shots are only worth $10, you're like, Matt, you're fired. That's a terrible idea. You want to spend $50 to make $10? Terrible business idea. But if it's $100, hey, suddenly $50 makes a lot more sense. I think a lot of companies don't understand at a fundamental level their unit economics of behaviors, right? And how much they actually make if they can change a behavior. And I think that's fundamental work that we need increased sort of data and finance knowledge about. And I think actuaries are really exciting places to do that. I think I would love to see a behavioral science informed CFO. I think Amy Hood at Microsoft is a great example of somebody who I think has made great strides for helping Microsoft understand, hey, what is the true value of usage over the true value of sales, right? You've seen that entire organization pivot to a usage-based model instead of a license-based model. I think that was a great victory. So I think there's a lot of really good examples from the market.
Great, I'll keep that in mind. That was very insightful. I think Eric has one last special question for you.
Yeah. Maybe one final question before we move to our next session. In fact, it is the same that I have asked before to John List in our conversation, and I think it is a very important one for our audience. What is your one piece of advice that you would give to a chief innovation officer who want to start applying behavioral science to their work?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I'll give a controversial answer because I think it's the role of speakers to push the bounds a little bit. What I would say is stop thinking about behavioral scientists, right, as a singular noun role that you can point to someone and be like, that over there, that's our behavioral scientist. Behavioral science is a process that you use. It is a discipline that you apply. And it's one that can be applied by designers and strategists and data scientists and qualitative researchers and all these different roles. So rather than thinking of it as something that, you hire one of, try to think of it as something that your whole team does, right? It's a set of capabilities and skills that they can learn. Many of your employees don't even know basic experimentation skills. How do you teach those? How do you upskill the people that you have? They're all capable of understanding them. They just haven't been taught that probably since about 8th grade, right? How do you bring back those skills that are useful to them so that they can do that in situ of where they are? So that's my tip. My tip is stop thinking about hiring a behavioral scientist. Maybe you need a behavioral science leader, but start thinking about how you're going to upskill your whole team to a place where they have these skills and are able to engage. Show them this conference, get them involved, have them watch and read and learn the things that they can do.
Yeah, well, I'll just add one more thing. I really like the example in the book about the janitor at Pepsi, at Frito-Lay. And that was about, bringing the culture also to help kind of like embrace the behavioral science culture.
100%. And it turns out that's an apocryphal story. It's not actually how I found out after the creation that's not how Flaming Hot Cheetos came about. But it's still, I'll give a second tip, Eric. I'm gonna horn in and I'll give a second tip, which is fiction, right? We have this gravitation towards non-fictional books, non-fictional stories, things that are true. There's a lot of truth to be had in fiction. Even if that story turns out to be apocryphal, it is still a good demonstration of the world as we want it to exist. One where a janitorial worker can suggest an idea and we have a way to ingest that and we have a way to interact with it and we have a way to help them promote it, right? Even if that's not what happened with Flaming Hot Cheetos, I don't really care, right? What I care about is that is how we want it to happen in your company. So take the lesson from that. Read fiction, right? Don't read my book, read fiction books. Fiction helps us imagine these imaginary worlds and how we get there from the world we have. Particularly science fiction does that. So stop thinking about a singular behavioral scientist and read science fiction.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for your insight. It was great to have you at the Human Advantage Conference.